Well, it being 1:30, we'll call this meeting of the Legislative Ethics Committee to order. And welcome everybody to our meeting today. We have a busy docket and a busy agenda today, and hope to get through it all as quickly as we can. The first item of business today on our agenda is approval of the minutes. This is the minutes of our last meeting, February 13th.
I move approval of the very extensive minutes.
I second the fact that they were very extensive. We'll have to read them. Are there any amendments, any changes? All those in favor of adopting the minutes as proposed, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And all those opposed say nay. You've adopted the minutes from February 13th. Next item of business is addressing a complaint. This is complaint 2023-5. This is a complaint which ordinarily would be confidential at this point in time, but the person complained of has waived confidentiality. And so we are going to address it in public today. That's going to be followed by another complaint, 2023-6. And the person complained of in that complaint has also waived confidentiality. There was responses to both those complaints filed by an attorney for both of the persons complained against, Attorney Fitzgerald, and indicated that the complaints be joined, that they be heard together. I think that probably that would be it. That the person who's made the complaints would have something to say about that as well. So, Mr. Murphy, and I don't know, yes, do you have any objection that those two complaints were heard together?
I do not, sir, because they both, actually all three, the one that still remains confidential, all pertain to the same laws being violated.
So, then if you have no objection to that, then what we'll do is we could hear, I think, unless the parties have, any other parties have any objections, that we could hear them together. Does the committee feel that that would be appropriate? Or would you like to keep them separate?
I guess when we take action on them, we'll take action on them individually, but we'll hear evidence at the same time.
Right.
I have no objection to that.
Okay. You have no objection? I think what we're doing today is what's called an initial review. If you look at the rules for our committee, the committee meeting, the very first thing that the committee does is conduct an initial review. Typically, we do that facially. We just do that on the face of the complaint and make a determination as to whether or not we think the complaint should go forward. So, but because confidentiality was waived in this case, I suggested that it might be a good idea to have both the person making the complaint and the people complained against on those two complaints come in and basically flesh out the complaints for us. And so what we did was invite people to come in and for 10 minutes and to speak to us, give them each 10 minutes to explain their side of the story, what they felt was important. So that would help us in making a decision as to whether or not we should go forward with the complaints after our initial review. So what I would plan to, and that's 10 minutes for them to speak. The committee obviously may have questions as well after that, but you have up until 10 minutes to do that. We're gonna make it a flat 10 minutes so we don't go on all afternoon today, okay? And so what we'll do is we will call upon Mr. Murphy, who's made the complaints first, and he can explain why he's brought the complaints, why he feels that there's an ethical violation that should be addressed, and perhaps what he thinks the remedy for that violation should be, if in fact they did find that there was a violation. So if you want to step up.
And do I need to turn this on?
No.
Okay.
I don't believe we're broadcasting. So.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the New Hampshire Legislative Ethics Committee. You've all received my complaint in great detail. So I want to take this in a somewhat different direction. And I have given a copy of this to Mr. Lambert for passage later on. I also handed him a packet of information. Let me start with this abstracted quote from Commander Salamander, who is a retired Navy officer, lamenting about the sad state of affairs in this country, which I have lightly edited. I thought it apt as it summarizes much about what this hearing is about: abandonment. If there is a characteristic of the last few years, it is abandonment. Abandonment either of duties, friends, families, or of principles, which was once seen as a disgrace and a blight upon one's honor. Now, I don't think so. We abandoned thousands, really tens of thousands, of American citizens, family members, and allies in Afghanistan. Recently, we abandoned almost as many in Sudan. After a news cycle or two, the press loses interest. Our politicians, or at least most of them, move on. The fault is not so much our government or our civil society, but really it is all of our fault. We allow this abandonment, this disregard for ethics, the amoral failure of the responsibility to protect and honor our word, to stand up for unwritten agreements. Abandonment breaks the bonds of stewardship that binds a society together. We fail the fundamentals. And then we wonder why we cannot execute anything effectively anymore. We shrug at dishonor and then wonder where the quality of civil society went. No one in power is challenged. No one is held accountable unless it fits a certain agenda, end quote. Let me add to that. I would add to the abandonment of honor, of courage, of loyalty, of honesty, of duty, of promises, and of oaths that are the embodiment of all of those attributes and more. Oaths seemingly seem nothing nowadays, merely a string of words that are mandatory to say to assume the seat that we, the people, have put our elected representatives into. A mere formality never to be referenced again by those saying it. I have watched many of those ignore those words already. I'm betting that many who say the words could now be easily convinced that they could be abandoned, cast aside, just as easily as they say the Constitution is ancient and meant for a time that no longer exists. By the way, I happen to heartily disagree with that notion. It does seem that many certainly forget their oaths as soon as they are said. Why? It would remove what an oath by elected representatives is supposed to culminate in: accountability. The promise and plea to constituents: hold me responsible to my promise, my oath to you, at all times. That is the summary of why I brought these complaints. This old-fashioned belief that such things should matter, not just to some, but to all. But a quaint notion as a stroll in the park in Victorian finery. In all three complaints, who was willing to hold them accountable to their promises, to faithfully adhere to the black and white text of the written law, and to demonstrate a fealty to the law, not just in action, but as a matter of the heart? Sadly, there has been no mass uprising. Apathy, a lack of knowledge and awareness reigns. Hopefully, I hope once again here in New Hampshire, one person can make that difference. Sadly, all three abandoned the oaths and the promises to strictly follow the law. They willingly broke their oaths to us all. Worse, they broke the trust that we expected. We should not, cannot, adopt a lesser standard of measure for them simply because, well, it's politics. The bigotry of low expectations from those that are supposed to be servant leaders. Yet, that is what they have done. In each complaint, I have provided both several violations and multiple examples thereof. While they are summary in form, I can tell you that far more supporting detail is available on GraniteGrok.com, of which I am the founder, and I go to a lot of events, and then I report on them in detail. Videos were often embedded in those posts showing their actions and words as acts of accountability. You can hear their own words and watch their own actions without me being the filter. There are additional videos backing up these assertions on my YouTube channel. Full recordings, however, is on the delegation meetings. Full recordings of the delegation meetings, with one notable budget subcommittee exception, are also on the Belknap County's Video on Demand found on the Lakes Region Public Access. So you don't have to even read GraniteGrok. Good government is one that is open and transparent, and whose procedures can be known and followed by the public. We in New Hampshire deserve nothing less, but that is what occurred. In New Hampshire, the latter is prescribed in statute. That process is lost when the law is ignored. All three representatives were warned by more experienced ones and others, like me, that they were in the wrong. They willfully disregarded the laws that prescribe the mandatory actions expected of them. They should not, cannot be tolerated. In reviewing each complaint, I ask that the committee either remove them from office for such blatant disregard for their oaths, as in faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all duties incumbent upon me as a state representative according to the best of my ability, agreeably to the rules and regulations of this Constitution and the laws of this state of New Hampshire. They decided to fail. Failing to come to such a conclusion of removal, I ask that you advance a censorship finding. In the positions of leadership that they sought comes the responsibility to study, learn, and inculcate such laws that govern them. They ignored that. I know that as an SB2 Budget Committee member, once elected, I made sure to study all the laws governing the Budget Committee's processes, as well as municipal level budgets, school districts, and water district budget processes. If I held myself to such a high standard to show good faith to those who voted for me, shouldn't I then be able to hold my elected representatives to the same standard with respect to the delegation laws, RSA 91A and RSA 24(9)C and D? To summarize, simply to follow the law. Thank you for your service and time in protecting the reputation and dignity of the New Hampshire legislature. And if there are any questions at this time, I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, procedural question.
Yes.
I understand that we are combining complaints number 5 and 6 of 2023. Are we also combining 2020 number 7, or is that separate?
Second.
Okay. Perhaps the witnesses should be reminded that only the 2 complaints are in public session and not the 3rd.
Understood. And I would like to be able to say I'm saving the committee time, because I would be saying the same thing for all 3. I have not identified who the 3rd complainant is.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Other questions? Yes.
So we're the Legislative Ethics Committee, and we are charged with applying the provisions of the ethics guidelines. Can you tell us specifically what ethics guideline you think was violated?
I think that in violating New Hampshire law is certainly part of that ethics process. That when there was, as I've said, a willful disregard and trying to mash up 2 different laws in the case of one, failure officially send out notices in the second opinion, that shows a disregard for what they have given in their oaths. That in itself should be an ethics violation, correct?
We're charged with violations of what's written in this book, and I'm asking which specific guideline was violated. It seems like you're alleging violations of the right to know law, 91A.
That is correct.
And so you're aware that the process for complaints about 91A goes to an ombudsman?
It can, as well as to Superior Court.
So have you pursued those?
I have not yet.
Okay.
This is a first step.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, so just to follow up on former Speaker Seitek's question, so is it your view that any violation of the law is a basis to take some ethics committee action against the legislator?
In the general, I would say yes, but in these first two cases, and I will speak only to those two, there were multiple instances of disregard for that law. Once can be viewed as a mistake, and if after apologizing, make sure that that mistake doesn't happen again, then I would say a little harm, but no foul. However, both of them were counseled by others, other representatives more experienced in this, as well as others. I tend to use RSA 91A a lot, that they were in the wrong, and that they weren't publicly noticing the meetings, which meant that the public could not attend unless they were intimately involved with the representatives who happened to casually say, "Oh, we have a meeting." I was locked out of two of them because I did not know of those meetings. I put in a right to know, as my complaint said, to prove that the nuance in one of the meetings that can be viewed in the video, that the noticing did not take place. I did it at the general ledger account level of the county's budget to prove that the 3 budget subcommittee meetings were never addressed by invoice or remittance to the Daily Sun, to which RSA 91A says that the paper of record needs to have an ad by the delegation to promote the public meeting. That was wrong. They ended up having to say, "Oops, we have to have a make-up meeting," because those meetings were illegal, because they weren't properly noticed. We happened, while I was on the budget committee, improperly noticed a couple of our subcommittee meetings. We realized that we were off by just a few hours. Afterwards, we said all that work for that subcommittee meeting must be scrubbed clean. We have to call the meeting again and start from scratch. That's how seriously I take this. So for me, this is not rocket science. You read the law, you learn the law, because your responsibility as an elected representative depends on it. Willful denial that you have to follow it, simply by dint of not doing it, should be an ethics complaint, should be an ethics violation.
Well, first, no.
I have a couple quick questions. So,
Absolutely.
So, having read your complaint, there are basically 2 sort of events or series of events. One is an initial meeting that was called on a Friday and then happened on a Monday. No adequate notice for that meeting. And then subsequent budget meetings.
That is correct, and I think that the first is more egregious than the second.
Okay. So that's so a question about and I wasn't clear from your complaint, and I wasn't clear from the response either as to the status of Representative Bean or the clerk at the time, as to whether they were holding those positions at that time. Representative Bean the chair at the time, or was he just a delegation member?
Now, let me go back to the first
and
one.
same with Mr. O'Hara.
Yes.
Representative O'Hara, was he officially the clerk at that time, or not?
At the time of the first incident that you brought up, both were just members of the delegation. And the reason why it is rather egregious is that Representative Bean tried to do a mashup of both RSA 91A and 24.9D, trying to use the best of both for his political advantage, in my humble opinion. RSA 91A does have the parachute clause whereby the chair of a political body, in this case the delegation, if so warranted for an emergency meeting, can call that meeting, and using RSA 91A can have that within 2 business days. The problem is that Representative Bean tried to call that, and he was not the chair. That was the Honorable Mike Sylvia, who was at the time, decided that it was not an emergency and therefore did not have to call a meeting. Now, the fallback for that is under 24.9D. 24, as you all know, governs the actions of a delegation. Has the ability that if the chair of the delegation, again, Mike Sylvia, decides not to call a meeting, if there is a majority of the quorum, as outlined in 9D, agree to have a meeting, they can have that meeting. And I have no problem with that. The problem was in trying to do a mashup of the 2-day notice from 91A and trying to substitute that in for the 7-day required notice of 9D. That's why, and I told him personally he could not do that. I made it clear to other people, you cannot do that. I have a handout that I gave to Mr. Lambert, and the last part of that is an email thread that I had with the county attorney, because I started asking questions. Why are you letting this go? He sent me the memorandum that he sent out, and while I am just a retired software engineer, words matter, especially when you're writing code. A single punctuation mark out of order can cause what we call an ABN, an external error. But it's the same here in the law. You cannot quote the law to say something can happen, but without but by leaving out the relevant part of the law in your memorandum, you give the wrong impression. And that last part of that packet that I gave to Mr. Lambert goes through that entire discourse that I had with County Attorney Lavernos. And it's one point when I tried to insist, you have to also use these pieces. He never mentioned the chair of the delegation had to be the one triggering that you cannot do 2 days versus 7 days. He stopped answering. And I thought that was egregious. I've opined upon that on multiple occasions. And I told other delegation members, you can't do this. This constitutes an illegal meeting. And later on, well, we know what happened.
If I can just follow up on that.
Sure.
Because I think that's the question I have. So this meeting was called on
A Friday.
On a Friday, happened on a Monday.
Correct.
As I read it. When was Representative Bean, using Representative, when did you give him notice, or when was he given notice that was a problem?
It was discussed beforehand and discussed afterwards. I discussed it a couple of times with other members as well, that you cannot do a mashup of 2 laws and make it stick.
Okay, but so
as far as the exact timing, the hour, I cannot
get a sense of whether somebody said to Representative Bean before he called the meeting on Friday, you can't do that.
The problem was that he had no authority to call the meeting in the first place. And Representative Bean was also a member of the Guilford Budget Committee. And I knew him for a couple of years before he became a representative. He knew how RSA 91A worked, because I would say, not just faithfully, but made it an imperative that that's how we followed it in doing our business, to make sure that the public knew when we were going to have a meeting to make sure that they could attend and see how their elected representatives were acting towards the budget. So I was very surprised when he tried to not follow the law. And that's why, and I've written about it a number of times. I could probably go back in my writings and find out the time and date. I apologize, I don't have it on the top of my head. The calling of the other meetings, that's I'm not even sure how to describe how I felt once I found out later. But again, that is the clerk's responsibility to place the public notices that weren't. And again, I did the right to know against the county. No invoices were ever received, no remittances were ever paid. I did get from the county attorney the 2 ads that were placed, but they were for the full delegation meetings and not the subcommittees. I also talked to the publisher, Adam Hersham of the Daily Sun, and he sent me the 2 ads that I had received from the county. I received the invoices he sent, and he said there are no ads for those 3 subcommittee meetings. And it wasn't on the website.
And I guess if I could just follow up on the same
Sure.
line, and that is, and I think there was as I read the response, there was an acknowledgement that they were not properly noticed, and allegedly corrective action taken after the fact, but they weren't. Was Representative O'Hara was a participant or involved in those budget meetings?
Yes, and so was
And
Representative Bean.
Was Representative Bean involved with those meetings?
Yes, because they drew payments for those meetings.
Well, in terms of involvement, drawing payments is one thing, but by drawing payments, are you saying they attended?
They attended, and the video confirms it. The own delegations videos up on LRPA shows that they were there, except for the first subcommittee meeting because that recording was canceled. And I note that in my testimony that you will receive a copy of.
And if I could, one more question, who chaired those meetings?
I'm afraid I might get myself in trouble if I mention the name right now because of confidentiality.
Okay, thank you. Since I asked a ton of questions, anybody else have any questions?
And I am happy to answer at length, as you can tell.
Thank you for coming. I'm sorry.
Chairman, I have one question. With respect to the complaint number 5, you mentioned that the subcommittee meetings, there were no requirements. There were requirements of minutes and motions for the subcommittee meetings, and they weren't met. I was just wondering, where are the requirements for the motions and meetings minutes that you referred to there?
In RSA 91A, that on each action, a motion has to be made, seconded, and it has to be noted in the minutes, and that was not done at the correct times. I'm going to add that. And again, that is the fault, in my opinion, of the clerk. And he was told this was a problem.
Told
By another representative
at what point?
several times during the span of those 3 the budget subcommittees. There was great consternation that most of it was not well done.
Any other questions?
I think it exceeded the 10 minutes.
Yeah, well, those are good questions, yes.
Prerogative of the chair.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Grok TV.